You have a house that's more comfortable, you have a car that drives better, it's less expensive, and you've cut your emissions by 60%. Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, I call life's formula. They make up over 99% of the atoms of every living cell on the planet. The other revolution besides producing electricity is now, of course, the battery revolution. So in the last 2 years or so, California, the state of California, for example, has added the capacity of 8 nuclear power plants in batteries. This summer, Texas had record demand, more electricity demand than it's ever had before, and didn't have any problems with the grid. And the reason is the wind was blowing hard and batteries were kicking in and solar panels were kicking in. About half of the land surface that is not covered in ice is used for food production. It's by far the biggest human land use. About 15%, so about the size of the entire South American continent, we grow crops on. There are machines that can pull CO2. There are many processes, and there are many startup companies right now who are investing a huge amount of money in pulling CO2 out of the air to fight climate change and essentially to sell that carbon credit to somebody else. So battery electric vehicle, heat pumps for your house, fly less. The last thing I'll say is eat less red meat, okay, and dairy. And after that, give yourself a break and live your life and have a good time, okay? Like, those are the big ones.
What does it take to change the world? It is the very first question from the book Elemental: How 5 Elements Changed Earth's Past and Will Shape Our Future. And today I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Porder, the author of the book, Associate Provost for Sustainability, Professor of Ecology at Brown University. And today we're going to talk about climate and environmental changes and a few innovations and approaches that help with sustainability. This is an Hour of Innovation podcast where we explore innovations and unique approaches to solve the challenges. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Vit. It's great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. So let's start with the book. And what was the core message that you were trying to pass with your book?
Yeah, so the core message is essentially summed up by, it's a very rare for organisms, for living things to actually make a big impact on the world. There have been, however, a few times where it has happened. And interestingly, the way it's happened each time has some really strong commonalities. And if we can understand the thread that connects humans, who are a world-changing organism, to the very few who have done similar things in the past, we can actually use that knowledge to build a more sustainable future by learning from what our predecessors did and understanding how our activities share similarities with them. We can then modify our activities in a way that helps us build a more sustainable future. And so I thought that although there's an enormous amount of conversation about climate and sustainability, given the modern challenge, that this long time perspective of throughout the history of life, this is a very rare thing, but a very rare thing that always kind of happens the same way when it happens. I thought that was an interesting and worthwhile take, especially because it can help us understand how to move forward.
I see. And then you also introduced this concept of life's formula. Could you elaborate on it a little bit, please?
Yeah, sure. It's fascinating. So, I come from a background. I come from a background with lots of different things, but one of those things is biology. And, when you think of biology and you think about different organisms in the world, you think about, okay, we're related to the primates, or we are a primate and we're related to the great apes. And how is that different from a bacteria? And there are millions and millions of species on Earth, from the smallest bacterium to the largest blue whale, right? And in some ways, there's an enormous interest in understanding that diversity of life. But actually, we're all basically made of exactly the same stuff. If you were to take me and a tree and a bacteria and grind us up and analyze our chemistry in some magic machine that we can do, you would get the same elements making up all of our bodies in the same order of abundance. So the most abundant is hydrogen, the next most abundant is oxygen, the next most abundant is carbon, the next most abundant is nitrogen, and the next most abundant is phosphorus. And so those five together, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, I call life's formula. They make up over 99% of the atoms of every living cell on the planet. And as far as we know, we're the only life around. So far, at least, that's all we know. So as far as we know, all life has the same formula. What's fascinating about that, well, that's interesting in and of itself, but what's fascinating about that is that the place where we live, the land of Earth, the water of Earth, the air of Earth, none of those places share the same formula as us. And so all life has to fight to get those elements out of the environment. And so if you back out from this idea of, well, bacteria is really different from a whale, is really different from a tree. And of course they are different, right? But all of them have to solve the same problem, which is how do we get those elements in the right mix to build our bodies? And it turns out that the times when organisms revolutionize, either through evolution in the past or through innovation in the case of humans, revolutionize our access to those elements, that's when we really change the world. And so it's that link that I think makes life's formula so interesting.
Yeah, so basically, we're made of the same things in the same ratios, but we use surroundings to grab those elements out of the nature and use them for energy and multiplication, population increase, and things like that. And basically, what were those three organisms that changed the world? If you can maybe mention and how they changed that.
Sure. So before I do, though, I want to say one more thing about the way the world changes. So I told you about how all of us organisms are made of the same stuff. Okay, and that's part of the puzzle, and that's really interesting. The other part is that those same elements, at least four of those five same elements, make up the gases in our atmosphere that keep the planet at a given temperature. So everyone's heard of carbon dioxide, CO2. So that's two of the elements. Another strong gas that acts as a blanket to keep the planet warm is methane, that's CH4. So that's carbon and hydrogen. Another strong gas that keeps the planet warm is nitrous oxide, which is two nitrogens and an oxygen. So again, drawing from the same pool of elements. And the last one is water vapor, H2O. So we can think of this as like, okay, if I want to pull, if the two most abundant elements in my body are H and O, then it was great to be near water, right? And that's why human civilization and all other organisms are dependent on water. They need that H and O for their bodies. But we also need carbon to build all our cells. And once you start pulling carbon from the air, for example, or putting it into the air, then you're changing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so the key part about life's formula is both that it's important for organisms, but also it links organisms to the blanket that keeps the planet warm, the atmosphere that keeps the planet warm. So when we go to school, we hear the phrase, Earth is a living planet. And that is true. And it always meant to me going to school that Earth has living things on it. And that's totally true, of course. You and I are sitting here talking on Earth. But it's also a living planet because Earth is shaped by life. It's a two-way street. And that is, as far as we know, unique in the universe so far, at least. I'm sure eventually we'll find life elsewhere. But for now, Earth is the only planet that both hosts living organisms and is shaped by living organisms. So with that in mind, let's take a time capsule back, not 10 years or a million years or even 100 million years or even a billion years. But let's go back to 4 billion years ago when life first, or 3.9, but let's round and say 4 billion years ago when life first emerges on Earth. What's the planet look like back then? It's just coming out of a period where meteorites were hitting so often that nothing really could survive. So things are beginning to calm down from the meteorite perspective. And the world was pretty much entirely ocean, so no continents popping up. And the air was very similar in some ways and very different in others. So what was similar about it? It was similar in that all the atoms in the air, all of the gas in the air was nitrogen. Two nitrogen atoms bonded to each other. Today, it's about 80% of the air is two nitrogen atoms bonded to each other. You and I breathe that out, and breathe it in, breathe it out, no effect on us whatsoever. That's true for almost all organisms on the planet. What there was not was any oxygen in the air. So you or I would have suffocated immediately. It took it took almost 2 billion years for a set of organisms, the first world-changing organisms, which are called the Cyanobacteria, which still exist today, to evolve two independent chemical processes that allowed them to gather elements from the environment. One of them is they evolved a way to do photosynthesis, to use the energy of the sun to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to build their cells. They evolved an efficient way to do that. The other thing they did is they evolved a way to pull nitrogen, and nitrogen is a key component of all proteins, of DNA, of all of the sort of almost all of the important biological molecules. They evolved a way to pull nitrogen out of the air and use it for their bodies. So what does that mean? It means that they could build their bodies out of carbon that they pulled from the air very efficiently. And they could get nitrogen out of the air to build the cellular machinery to pull out more carbon. So the example I use in the book is like they built both a better electric car and a better battery factory to power the electric car. And so as a result of that, they were able to wildly proliferate across the oceans. They became sort of the dominant organisms in the ocean by doing this new way of photosynthesis and the new way of using nitrogen to build the machinery to help them do photosynthesis. An accidental byproduct of their success, of the way that they lived, of the chemical reactions in their bodies, was they dumped oxygen into the environment. And that went on for hundreds of millions of years. I mean, mind-bogglingly long amounts of time. But eventually, that oxygen began to bubble up out of the ocean. And it is only because of them and the oxygen that they produced that multicellular life could evolve. But another thing that happened is that at the time, the main thing keeping the planet warm, the blanket that I talked about, that greenhouse gas blanket that keeps the planet warm, it wasn't carbon dioxide back then, it was methane. And methane is a really strong blanket, and it was keeping the planet unfrozen. Oxygen destroys methane. So here comes these cyanobacteria. They evolved two key innovations. New way of getting carbon, new way of getting nitrogen. By accident, they release some oxygen to the environment. Who cares? It's just going into the environment, like whatever, it doesn't matter. And it didn't matter for a really long time. But when eventually it built up enough, it destroyed the very blanket that was keeping the planet warm and plunged the planet into a global ice age. So the story is they innovate evolutionarily, like they didn't do it on purpose. They evolved these incredible strategies for pulling life's formula from their environment. The byproduct of that, the accidental waste, they just ejected into the environment, right? It just went into the cell and out of the cell. But eventually, that byproduct changed the blanket that was keeping the planet warm and took it from warm enough for there to be liquid water on the surface to an ice age. Just by accident. This is by far the biggest environmental change of all time, and it's not just the ice age. Remember, they set the stage for there to be an atmosphere that we can breathe. And that's another really important lesson from this first set of world-changing organisms. It's not that life can't live in a hot planet or a cold planet. The transition between states is what's really catastrophic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a whole set of organisms, for example, that have never seen free oxygen in the air, right? And then all of a sudden there's oxygen in the air, like all those other ones that used to live for 2 billion years in an anoxic place, now they're out of luck. And there's new organisms that evolved to take advantage of an oxygen air environment like we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so it's the change that's the hard part, right? It's
Yeah.
like driving a car at 60 miles an hour is not dangerous. Driving at 0 miles an hour is not dangerous, but slamming into a tree and slowing from 60 to 0, that's dangerous. Right? It's the
Yeah.
change that's the problem. And so cyanobacteria teach us that lesson. I know that was a very long story. I'm going to give a short story for the second world changers. So I asked us to go back 4 billion years. And then the cyanobacteria story, that ends about 2.2 billion years ago, which is about half of all of Earth history. We're going to fast forward now to only 400 million years ago. So it seems like a lot of time, but it's like if the Earth's history was a clock going from 12 noon to midnight,
Mm-hmm.
you'd be at about 10:30 p.m.
Yeah.
By the time you get to 400 million years ago. So 400 million years ago, a very similar story plays out with a new set of organisms, and these are the organisms we call plants. They came
Mm-hmm.
out of the ocean. They brought the same photosynthetic reactions that the cyanobacteria used onto land, and they too made a whole bunch of innovations. I don't think it's necessarily worth going into the detail. If people are interested, I hope they'll read the book. But they made a whole series of evolutionary innovations that allowed them to live in this environment on land. And as I started off by saying, if you're made mostly of hydrogen and oxygen, it really helps to live in the water. And
Yeah.
it's really hard to live on land. So plants had a lot of evolution to do before they could live on a dry spot, especially
Mm-hmm.
because they can't move, right? They're stuck
Yeah.
wherever they are. So anyway, they move on to land and they too revolutionize how much carbon dioxide they can pull from the air. They actually become the world's greatest miners. They pry into the soil to get water. They actually create soil and pry into it to get water, but also to get phosphorus, which is the last element in life's formula that we haven't talked about yet. They break down rocks, which is where phosphorus is stored, and they pull it directly into their roots. And these innovations allow them to also change the atmosphere and once again take the planet from a very warm time in geologic history, much
Mm-hmm.
warmer than today, to a time where there are again near global ice ages. So again, they are sort of victims of their own success. They make a incredible series of evolutionary innovations. It allows the land plants, the plant forest to spread across the continents for the first time in the history of the world, like towering what we would think of as forests, evolve. And they change the atmosphere so much that they take us from like a global hothouse to a global ice age. This is again not a problem. Life can survive in either state, but the transition is very dramatic, and we see one of what we call the great extinction events
Mm-hmm.
occur as a result at the end of this period. And the last thing I'll say about the land plants, before I presume we move on to the more modern stuff, is that it is their dead bodies, the swamps that contained the first forests, that 300 million years later, human beings discover as coal, first in China and then industrially in England and Europe in the 1800s. And it is the dead bodies of our world-changing predecessors that then begin to power industrial human society and make us then the third great world-changing organisms.
Yeah. 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 That's a very long time for the first organism to change environment and slow by little, I guess, right? Trees, I think, did it faster, a little bit.
I mean, to be clear, uh, both of them took 100 million years or more
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
have a really right.
So
So we're
that
talking
scales
orders.
faster.
Yeah, it's faster, but like we're arguing about very slow versus very, 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 very slow.
Yes. So and now moving on to the third organism, which is us. I think we took it to the whole new level, and the speed of changes in the environment has been dramatic for the last 200, 300 years. And so what are people doing then exactly to change the environment, and maybe some lessons learned from the previous organisms?
Yeah. So there are there are many things. So let me go through them sort of sequentially. So if the cyanobacteria, roughly speaking, made innovations in carbon, pulling carbon from the environment, and carbon is inherently linked to energy. So we'll talk about carbon and energy interchangeably. So the cyanobacteria made innovations in taking carbon from their environment and taking nitrogen from their environment. And nitrogen is a key sort of food product, and it allows you to build your proteins. In the case of cyanobacteria, those proteins are used for photosynthesis and capturing more carbon. The land plants, in contrast, they made innovations in getting water because they built these root systems that allowed them to get water even on land. And they also used those roots to mine for phosphorus out of the rock. So what are human beings doing? Well, we've talked a little bit about the carbon part of it. We have found the dead bodies of other organisms, like the land plants, that are now coal and oil and gas, and we are burning those for energy, releasing their carbon back to the atmosphere. I'll come back to that because there's a key difference between us and them that I want to highlight. But we have that innovation is our energy source. What else have we done? We've used the energy from those fossil fuels in an industrial process to pull nitrogen from the air. So just like the cyanobacteria, but we become the first multicellular organisms in the history of the world, in the history of life, to pull nitrogen directly from the air so that we can use it. And what do we use it for? We dump it on our farm fields to fertilize our plants so that we can have enough food for all of us. In fact, there are about 8 billion people on the planet. Without nitrogen fertilizer, we could only feed about 4 billion people. So half of us are here because of an invention in the early 20th century that allowed us to make an industrial process to get nitrogen out of the air. What else do we use our fossil fuels for? We use them to mine phosphorus. So the great phosphorus deposits of the world are in Morocco and Western Sahara. It's a politically contested place. So if you ask one person, they'll say it's Morocco. And if you ask another person, it's Western Sahara, and it's a very politically contentious place. I'm not taking a stand on the politics of it. I'm just saying that geographic location is where the vast majority of phosphorus is. We mine that. Very similar process to what the land plants do with their roots. And we ship that phosphorus all over the world to fertilize our farm fields. And then the last thing we use fossil fuels for lots of things, obviously, like having this conversation. But one of the other major uses is we use those fossil fuels to move and store water. So there's actually more water stored in reservoirs behind dams than there is in all of the world's rivers. And we pull water from underground from these what we call aquifers, which just means water stored in the pore spaces in sand or rock. We pump that up and use that to irrigate our crops as well. So for nitrogen, phosphorus, and water, the vast majority of what we use is to give that stuff to plants that we then grow for food. So what is our innovation? Our innovation is a novel source of energy and a novel source of food from our environment, right? Which is the same as them. We're just going way faster, and we're doing both what the cyanobacteria did and what the land plants did, kind of on steroids.
Yeah, and it's only 8 billion of people, right? It's not like we have trillions of bacteria all over the place, even though they're only one cellular.
Right. So there's way less of us than there are of them, even to today. But I think there's another key and really important point that I think gives us some hope moving forward. So when the cyanobacteria changed the world, they changed because their population went up because they had access to all this nutrients and all this carbon and all this energy. For every additional cyanobacteria cell, there was more waste product. It's a fundamental property of their body. Like you can't have 2 cells without having twice as much waste. Human beings, the vast majority of the carbon energy that we use, we don't use in our bodies. We use to power everything else. We use to power our airplanes and our cars and our heating and our cooling and this internet conversation and all of that stuff. This fundamentally is a difference between us and our world-changing predecessors, because for every one of them, more of them meant more impact. But we have no interest in carbon. We have only interest in energy. And that can be gotten in other ways, right? And so we can, at least for the carbon side of things, for the global warming side of things, if you will, we can decouple our population from our impact in a way that our world-changing predecessors can't. And you're seeing that now, right? You're seeing that now as we transition off of fossil fuels and onto wind and solar. And I'm speaking to you from France right now. So here there's a lot of nuclear, and I know nuclear is contentious, but it is very low emissions source of energy. And so it doesn't really matter that there are 8 billion of us if we can get the energy we need without the waste product we want. Whereas for the bacteria and the plants, they had no out. Like if there were more of them, there was more impact. That doesn't have to be the case with us, at least for energy. For food, it's a little trickier, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But this is a critical point for sustainability. So you started by asking me, what's the lesson we can learn?
Yeah.
And I want to come back to that several times, but I'm going to come back to it here. If you are an innovative organism that changes the way that energy, carbon, nitrogen, water cycle around on this planet, you are going to change the world. And you can either do that by accident, like we're burning coal and by accident we put CO2 in the air and that changes the world. We're fertilizing our farm fields and by accident it runs off into the river and changes the chemistry of rivers and oceans. Or you can manage things purposefully and say, aha, these things are linked. And if we understand the link, we can actually figure out how to get what we want, which is energy and food and water. And we can manage the consequences or anticipate the consequences or minimize the consequences because we're thinking about both what we need and what we don't want. And this is the key in my mind. You cannot have a sustainable society without a foundation of the wise management of the elements in life's formula. That doesn't mean that that's all you need for a sustainable society. We need lots of things. But the fundamental chemistry of living organisms and the fundamental chemistry of our planet demands that if you're going to have a sustainable world, not a radically changing world, you need to manage the flow of these elements around the planet. And so what we're seeing in the transition to sustainability, and one of the things I'm most encouraged about over the last decade, is that this understanding is beginning to play out in real time. Like we are able now to produce energy in a way that is much less impactful. People are starting to come up with really innovative ways to manage the nitrogen that goes on farm fields and to manage the phosphorus that goes on farm fields. These are things that, have never really been done before, but our innovation is coming from all over the place, and that's really exciting. Even as it's scary because we're changing so fast.
Yeah. Well, that's a great transition, I guess, to start talking about all those things that are important for sustainability and what like areas of our lives we can have those impacts. So maybe let's start with home, just places where we live or work, right? All the buildings and things like that. So there are some ways to have better insulation, to preserve either heating or cooling. And also, and you mentioned this in your book also, the sewage, how we can better manage that and maybe recycle all of it or portion of it. Can you elaborate on this a little bit and explain what we have already and what people can use today?
Sure. I'll start by saying it really depends on where you are, because we don't have anything already, right? Like there's almost 1 billion people, probably closer to 2 billion people who live without regular access to electricity and clean water. And the impact that they're having on the planet is much lower than, say, the average American or European. And so what they can do to fix the problem is also much lower. So I'm going to move from a global we, because there is no global we in this context, to a sort of U.S. and European. Well, let's start with a U.S. context. Although I'm not sure who your audience is. It's probably multinational. But I'll start with the U.S. context because we are probably I know the most about it because I'm an American, but also because we have sort of the largest footprint per person of any large country. So what can we as Americans do? Well, the short answer to that is everything that all the energy we need for heating our house, moving ourselves around, lighting, heating our house, cooking our food, moving ourselves around, all of that needs to be electrified to run only on electricity, because electricity is the only place that can be made without causing major environmental change. So you can make electricity from windmills, from solar panels, from nuclear, from water in a way that does not emit CO2 or emits teeny amounts of CO2 just from the construction of the panels, and that will change too over time. And then if you can run everything off that electricity, then you so-called decarbonize, that is, you stop the global climate change effects of getting that electricity. So generally the answer is electrify everything, get your electricity from things that don't emit greenhouse gases. Okay, but let's talk practically about a house. So the first thing to do if you own a home or have access to doing this is to insulate your house. This is an old story, but insulate your house with a purpose. And the purpose is to get it good enough so that you don't need a furnace or a hot water heater or a stove that burns fossil fuels. Instead, you get something called a heat pump to move heat into your house from outside and run that off electricity. Now, this always sounds like magic to people when I talk about heat pumps. So let me just assure everyone who's listening that you have a heat pump in your house right now. It's your refrigerator. Okay. So what does a refrigerator do? How does it cool down the box on the inside? It uses electricity and a coolant gas, to absorb heat from the inside of the box, move that heat out into your kitchen, and dump it there. Okay? Which is why if you have a cat, your cat likes to lie right at the bottom of the refrigerator because it's nice and warm. Okay? That's how you make the inside of the box colder. You're actually moving heat, kind of pushing it uphill, which is what a pump does, right? A pump moves water from one place to another, uphill, the way it doesn't want to go, right? A heat pump does the same thing. It moves heat from a cold place to a warm place, which is the opposite way heat kind of wants to go, right? Heat usually wants to go to a cold place. So you need a pump to push it up that hill. So how does a heat pump work on a cold day? It pulls heat out of the outdoor air where it's already cold. It makes the outside a little bit colder, same as the inside of your fridge makes it a little bit colder. And it moves that heat and dumps it into your house where it's already warm, and it makes it a little bit warmer. Exactly the same as your refrigerator does, dumping heat out of the box and into your kitchen. The advantage of doing that is twofold. One, heat pumps are much more efficient than burning oil or gas to heat your house. And two, heat pumps run on electricity. So if you can then get your electricity from solar panels or windmills or batteries or nuclear or hydroelectricity, then all of a sudden you're now heating your house and nothing is being burned. It's not being burned in your house. It's not being burned outside your house. You're just getting clean electricity to heat your house by moving heat from the outdoors to the indoors.
Yeah.
The advantage of that, of course, is that you've eliminated combustion from your house altogether. So then you ask me what else? Well, the next step, or another step, actually probably equally, if for most Americans at least, it's actually equal to or more than their house emissions, is driving. But luckily, right, due to the innovations in the last really in the last 10 to 15 years, we can now run our cars off electricity too. In fact, the first cars were also electric. And we moved away from that technology because actually batteries weren't good enough back then. And so and then it got abandoned for gasoline because nobody cared very much about horrible air pollution that was killing us all, or climate change, which was known about at the time, but people weren't worried about. Anyway, now we find ourselves in the 2020s with batteries that really work. And so we should electrify both our heating and our transportation. For the average American, if you switch your house to heat pumps and you drive an electric car and you get solar panels, but even with, let's just leave the solar panels aside. If you heat your house with heat pumps, you heat your hot water with heat pumps, you drive an electric car, you can reduce your climate change emissions, the emissions that you make that cause climate change, by something like 50 or 60% if you're an average American. What have you lost? Actually, you've lost nothing. You have a car that drives better, way more fun to drive. I can testify to that personally. You have a house that's more comfortable, and by the way, has air conditioning now, because heat pumps in the summer work as air conditioners, and in the winter works as heaters, and they're the same thing, same unit. So you don't have to change anything. So you have a house that's more comfortable. You have a car that drives better. It's less expensive, and you've cut your emissions by 60%. Okay.
Yeah.
And then as you switch the source of your electricity, and this is already happening around the US and elsewhere in the world, of course, really quickly. Then, of course, the emissions that cause climate change that come from the production of electricity are falling every year. So every year your footprint is getting smaller while you're using things that are better anyway, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I mean about decoupling the effect that you don't want from the benefit that you get. I mean, I think that environmentalists have actually done a very poor job of this, because fossil fuels were an incredible gift to humankind. I mean, electricity and medicine and food, all of that comes from the energy that fossil fuels provided us. We benefited tremendously. We have made enormous strides on reducing poverty and increasing livelihoods and reducing maternal mortality. All of those things come from the benefit of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
But their side effect is going to be really bad for everybody. And fortunately, we are at a point now where we don't need them anymore, right? So we're going to take it's going to take a little time, of course, to transition, but we're going to keep those benefits. We're just going to get rid of the downside, right? And I think environmentalists who say, oh, fossil fuels are horrible, they open themselves up to sort of a charge of hypocrisy, because they, like all of us, enjoy these incredible benefits, and we shouldn't downplay them. It's just, you have now figured out how to keep those benefits and do it in a way that doesn't cause all of these other problems that nobody wants anyway, like millions of air pollution deaths every year, and a rapidly warming climate that's going to destroy all coral reefs and rainforests, and cause huge hurricanes, and cause huge wildfires, and cause huge droughts. We don't want any of those things. We just want energy, right?
Yeah.
Well, now we're to a point where we don't need to have the downside. So anyway, that's a bit of a long rant, but anyway, I'm on your podcast.
No, that's great. I think that's exactly how the argument can change, and people can be more educated that we really need energy. We don't really need to dig out
Right.
all those carbon things and burn them to produce energy. We have alternatives, and as technology becomes cheaper and more accessible to more and more people, we can use that and slow down the effects, and move towards more sustainable life and world. Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of times how energy is being produced with nuclear energy, and then wind and solar and some other maybe methods. So what are some of the ways, how is it done today? How can we maybe accelerate that? And also for the nuclear specifically, because I know many people are afraid of it. And I actually had read a book about some scientists in Europe, how they promote this idea of nuclear, but many people are afraid. We had a couple of, incidents in Japan, and then Chernobyl in Ukraine. So maybe also about that and how we can educate people, and is it really that dangerous?
Sure. Well, let's start with what's happening right now, because it's nothing short of a revolution. So in the last decade, solar, and particularly solar, but also wind, have emerged as the cheapest forms of energy available. So 90+% of all new energy projects in the developed world, in the wealthy world at least, are solar, and now solar plus batteries. Nobody is like it's a huge amount of energy addition globally. The vast majority of the energy addition is solar and some wind. Very little new fossil plants being built. Even where they are being built, they're being outpaced by solar. So solar is now the cheapest form of energy. This is definitely not true 10 years ago. So it's this plunging curve. There are still real challenges to how you finance it, and we can talk about that if you're interested. The problem, of course, with solar and wind are that they're intermittent. And our electricity distribution system is built around the idea of a stable power plant that can sort of ramp up and down when you need it. It's actually many, many different power plants, but they all can ramp up and down as needed, or some of them can. And so it's this delicately balanced system because the grid has no storage in it. So, I always, when I talk about this to people, I say, like, it's unbelievable if you think about it. When I turn on a light switch, somehow the energy providers out there know to provide that much more electricity, And then when I turn off the light switch, they know that they have to cut down. Now, of course, like, it's not just me, right? But they have to know, they have to balance supply and demand instantaneously. They don't have a buffer. It's amazing, right? And it's the biggest machine in the world. So it's truly incredible that it works at all. And I'm constantly amazed when I turn on the light. But the other revolution besides producing electricity is now, of course, the battery revolution. So in the last 2 years or so, California, the state of California, for example, has added the capacity of 8 nuclear power plants in batteries.
Wow.
So there are now times where batteries in the late afternoon, when the sun is beginning to go down, batteries have soaked up so much power because California has extra power during the day from all this solar they've installed. Batteries have sucked up so much power that they are now feeding back into the grid more than gas-powered power plants. 2 years ago, there were virtually no batteries in California. So, I mean, it's mind-boggling fast. Unless the sort of blue state champions say, oh, well, California is the most progressive state, and of course they're doing this, and they're good people, and all the people in red states are bad people. By the way, the biggest producers after California are all red states, and Texas is adding more solar and batteries than California right now. So Texas is going to pass California. And why are they doing it? They're not necessarily doing it for environmental reasons. They're doing it because it's the cheapest form of energy, and they can make a lot of money storing battery and selling it back to the grid. And by the way, I don't know if your listeners remember, but a couple of years back, there was a big ice storm in Texas. And it knocked out a whole bunch of power plants. It was a big mess. And Texas has perennially had problems with not having enough electricity in the summer on really hot days when everybody's using their air conditioner. This summer, Texas had record demand, more electricity demand than it's ever had before, and it didn't have any problems with the grid. And the reason is the wind was blowing hard, and batteries were kicking in, and solar panels were kicking in. And so what conservatives and liberals alike are beginning to see, and we don't agree on much in this country, but what conservatives and liberals alike are beginning to see is the incredible role that the combination of renewables and batteries can play in stabilizing the grid. So, and providing the power that we all need. Now, you asked about nuclear. I'm talking to you from France right now, where about 70% of the electricity actually comes from nuclear power plants. And I think that the best I can say about nuclear, because I'm not a nuclear scientist, and so I don't really want to speak to the safety issue, although the track record, like way, way, way more people have died of coal and of gas and of oil than have died of nuclear power plant problems. By a lot. We lose millions of people a year to air pollution from fossil fuels. And even Chernobyl, the death toll was quite low relative to millions of people. Right? Not to say it wasn't a huge disaster. And Fukushima, the Japanese incident, earthquake, tsunami, nuclear accident, there were no deaths, as far as I know, from the nuclear part of that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So I don't necessarily want to speak to the safety as an expert. I will say that fossil fuel deaths are way bigger than nuclear deaths. But of course, we have a way bigger fossil fuel infrastructure than we have nuclear infrastructure. So it's not really comparing apples to apples. It's like saying
Yeah.
fewer people die on skateboards than in automobiles, but there's way more miles driven on automobiles than on skateboards. So anyway, um, the nuclear issue, I think, is one that will be decided by cost and not necessarily by safety. So if you look at new nuclear approvals in the United States, for example, they're incredibly slow and hard to get and very costly. Microsoft, for example, is investing in restarting a nuclear power plant, the 3 Mile Island plant, because of their AI demands. If I had to guess, I would say that in the time it takes to rebuild or rebuild a substantial amount of nuclear in places where it doesn't already exist and have an easy path to creation, I would be surprised it didn't end up being much cheaper to have solar and wind and batteries than nuclear. Having said that, there's a new generation of nuclear reactors which the people who push it say are going to be cheaper, easier to approve, have much lower risk, etc. So I would say that this is a place where there is not a consensus. There are some people who see it as a real benefit. It certainly has a climate benefit, right? It doesn't emit CO2, so it has a climate benefit. It also, I think it's fair to say, has a lower risk than fossil fuels in terms of collateral damage. Although when it goes big, that's bad, right?
Yeah.
I think it's going to be decided on cost. And I think it may be very different, the cost to build a new nuclear plant in France, which is already heavily invested in nuclear, than it would be, say, outside of New York City, right? Where I think you're going to run into endless lawsuits and cost delays that ramp up the cost. Now, of course, offshore wind in the U.S. is facing a similar problem. So if I were a betting man, I guess I would bet against nuclear in the U.S. for siting and logistical reasons. But I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't tell you, who's going to win out. There's definitely, I would feel comfortable saying there's not a consensus on whether it's a good idea or whether it's possible to build it out fast enough to make a difference. We do know that it is possible to build out solar and wind and batteries fast enough to make a difference. So that's about as far as I'll go, given that I'm not a nuclear expert.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That still helps. That gives information. And the next topic is about agriculture and farming. And I think there are a couple of things we can talk about. First one is the actual, like you already said, the nitrogen and phosphorus being used and spread to help grow food, and also irrigation systems. And then this, in the recent years, more and more plant-based meats show up on the market. How does it all related and help us towards the sustainability?
Great. It's a great question. So we've talked a lot about energy, so let's leave that aside for now and talk about these other elements. So you might be interested, and your listeners might be interested to know that about half of the land surface that is not covered in ice is used for food production. It's by far the biggest human land use. About 15%, so about the size of the entire South American continent, we grow crops on. Okay, so corn and soybeans and wheat and sugarcane, etc. That's 15%. 35%. So instead of the size of South America, now think the size of Africa. Okay, use that to graze animals on: cows, sheep, pigs, etc. Well, pigs don't graze now so much, but anyway, we graze animals on that we also raise for food. Mostly cows. They're the big ones. But there are a lot of pigs also in the world, and a lot of chickens. There are more chickens by almost twice as many chickens on the planet as there are people. Actually, more than twice as many chickens on the planet. So that's a huge amount of land. And onto that land, we dump most of the nitrogen that we pull from the atmosphere by this industrial process, most of the phosphorus that we mine from Morocco and Western Sahara and all the other phosphorus mines scattered around the world. And about 75% of all the water humans use is dumped on our farm fields, on that 15% of land, roughly, that we grow crops on, right? One of the problems is that although animals take up this huge amount of land, 35% of the land surface, they provide very little in the way of calories and actually very little in the way of protein that couldn't be replaced. And so there's sort of two ways to make agriculture this fundamental human exercise that is, of course, we can't live without. There are two ways to make it more efficient. One way is to figure out when we add our fertilizer, when we add our water, how to keep it where we want it and only use the amount that we need and not waste anything. And then to recycle it really efficiently. And we can talk about that part. That sort of is the first part of your question. The second is that many millions and millions of acres of cropland is not used to feed people at all. In fact, if you look at the United States and look at all of the corn and soybean that is grown in the Midwestern United States, covering multiple states, almost none of that enters a human mouth directly. All goes to feed cows or other animals. And those animals are much less efficient than eating the plant directly. So we could feed, 10 times, roughly speaking, we could feed 10 times as many people if people ate plants than if they ate the animals that ate the plants. It's less for chickens, but just for cows. Let's talk about cows. So that means either we could have 10 times as many people. I don't think anybody wants that necessarily. Or we could keep the same number of people and use a whole heck of a lot less land to raise the food that we eventually consume, which would do what? It would allow trees to grow back in places they've been cleared, which would suck carbon dioxide out of the air and help with global warming. It would allow animals that migrate from tropics to the poles through the American Midwest have refuge in the prairie ecosystems that were once there instead of flying over essentially a biological desert of corn and soybean and wheat, right? All the while allowing people to continue to be well-fed and to get enough protein and all this stuff. So let's circle back and let me tell you about a friend of mine as an example of the underpinnings of life's formula and how you can think about managing that wisely in a way that retains the benefits and without the cost. So this is a colleague of mine named Lisa Schulte-Moore. She is a scholar at Iowa State University, brilliant thinker. She just won a couple of years ago, won the MacArthur Genius Award. And she had this idea, okay, in the Midwestern U.S., in Iowa, for example, Iowa is the most transformed landscape in the United States. Something like 98% of the landscape is not in its native state. And mostly that means it's corn and soybeans. So, and pig farms, a lot of pig farms. And now windmills, but I'll talk about that later. So, she looked at this landscape of corn and soybeans and she said, one of the huge problems with this landscape is that all this fertilizer that we're putting on these farm fields runs off into the rivers where we have huge water quality problems in Iowa, but then into the Mississippi and out into the Gulf of Mexico and causes huge environmental problems in the Gulf of Mexico, which affects fishermen who use the Gulf of Mexico, affects the water quality for anyone on the beach, whatever. Like, this is a big problem. How can we keep the fertilizer that we dump on the landscape, in the plants, not going into the river where we can't get it back? We spent all this money to dump it on the landscape, and then it just goes away. So she innovated this idea that across, if you imagine a hill sloping downhill, right? Across the hill, in perpendicular to the flow that water would go, her farmer partners planted strips of native prairie grasses. Not 100% of the farm, but like 5 or 10% of the farm. So now you have corn and soybean. If you Google prairie strips, you'll see these beautiful pictures on the internet. Corn and soybeans, regular old farms, but just 10% in these strips across the watershed, blocking the flow of water downhill of native prairie grass. what she finds in that is that they reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that you're losing, that the farmers want to keep on their land, but that they were losing to the rivers. Over 75% of that, and in some cases much more, is retained on the farm where you want it to grow your crops. Not only that, but now all of a sudden, the birds and other animals that use the landscape have a refuge in this desert of corn and soy. And not only that, but those strips, which can be moved up and downhill after 5 or so years, are rebuilding the soil. One of the big tragedies about the Midwestern U.S., which has some of the best soil in the world, is that a lot of it is now in the Gulf of Mexico because it's been eroded away. There's a joke in Iowa, where is the best topsoil in Iowa? And the answer is the Gulf of Mexico. Because it's washed away we've lost almost half of it from some counties in Iowa. That's a critical resource, the heritage of farming. And before European farmers, that was the heritage that indigenous people lived on for millennia. And we've flushed it down the river in the last less than 100 years. These prairie strips are not saying we're going to eliminate corn and soybean from Midwestern agriculture. But they're a small change that then allow us to reduce the environmental impact and keep the fertilizer where we want it and provide all these other benefits at virtually no cost to the farmer, right? And so this is an idea that Lisa's been working on for decades, and you're seeing now adoption like through the roof. She can't keep up with the demand of farmers calling in and wanting to implement this idea on their end. And so there's a great example of a modern industrial farm which produces a huge amount of food per acre, for sure, the best in the world, but had huge environmental impacts. And now all of a sudden we're learning to reduce those, right? So that's a good example of innovation. Now, the additional problem that all the corn and soy that's being grown is going to cows and not to people, or going to ethanol production and not to people. That's a separate problem, right? So we need to fix all aspects of the food system. It's a major contributor to climate change. It's a major contributor to all these other problems that we're having with misuse of life's formula. But that's just one small example of an innovation really thinking about the management of these elements, right? How do we keep building up carbon in the soil, nitrogen and phosphorus where we want it, not polluting our water, right? These 5 elements. That innovation is really targeted at those elements, even though that's not how she talk about it, but at its core, that's what it does, right? And so that's an example of how the food system can change. Now, you asked about plant-based meat. I think that the food question is very difficult because food is so dramatically cultural. Food is at the center of almost every culture. And I think there are some people for whom there are many people in the world for whom meat is either a sign of status, or they're just used to having it, or it's a sign that you're wealthy enough that you can eat meat or a lot of meat. And some places it's just culturally super important, right? And so if we could produce meat, there are some people who say, well, look, then let's produce meat. Let's just not use a cow to produce it, right? Like if you like a steak and we could produce a steak without a cow, the guy who founded Impossible Foods says this. He says, why are we using a 10,000-year-old technology to produce meat? Why don't we just produce it, right? It's not the meat that's the problem. It's the stupid way we still grow it, which is cows, right? So there are people like that. There are other people who say, well, we just have to reduce the amount of meat we eat, and however we do that is fine. And I guess I would put myself in that camp. I'm not globally, if we can't all eat an American diet with the amount of meat that Americans eat and sustainably manage the world, it would require too much land. There's just no way to do that. So if we want everyone to eat an American diet with that much meat, which I would argue is bad for lots of things, but then we're going to need to have some sort of lab-based or plant-based meat because we can't have that many cows.
Yeah.
Alternatively, cultures can change. So like I'm in France, where if you ask for a vegetarian plate at a French bistro, they're likely to say, oh, the salad is vegetarian, it just has salmon or ham. Like it's just culturally anathema. But if you like, I'm in Paris at the moment. So there are all of those French bistros that sort of don't have anything vegetarian, but there's also a lot of vegan and vegetarian restaurants popping up all over the place. And if you go into a rural supermarket in the U.S., you may very well find plant-based burgers, plant-based, Impossible Food, whatever, all these different alternative products. You'll also see almond milk and oat milk and soy milk instead of cow's milk, right?
Mhm.
And that's not just in Whole Foods or super swanky supermarkets for, coastal elites, liberal, college professors, right? It's like everywhere now, right?
Yeah.
And so those cultural things can change. My daughter grew up preferring plant-based milk to cow's milk.
Mhm.
And so things can change. Now, I have Brazilian colleagues who, when I say, no more steak, they look at me like I'm insane, right? And so different cultures will adopt different things. The fundamental limit to the system is we can't have this many cows. There's almost 1 billion cows on the planet, each of them weighing hundreds and hundreds of pounds. It's very inefficient to grow cows. It takes a huge amount of land, a huge amount of water. It produces a huge amount of greenhouse gases. And so somehow, as a global society, if it's going to be culturally different from place to place, we need to figure out how to transition. If part of that is making something that tastes and looks and feels like meat, but is based not on cows, I'm all for it. And if part of that is a cultural shift towards different kinds of dairy or whatever, I'm all for that too. The fundamental physical constraint is can't have this many cows and pigs and lambs and sheep on the planet. And so we have to figure out a way to reduce that. And that's going to vary culturally from place to place. Food is at the center of
Mhm.
culture. I would not be, it's not my job to tell people, what they should eat, but there is a physical constraint to how many animals we can grow
Yeah, I
based
see.
on life support.
Yeah, I see all these alternative foods in every store right now, in Costco, in
Yeah,
Giants, or whatever.
exactly.
So people have a choice basically, and whoever wants to switch, they should switch if they want to help out, I
Yeah,
guess.
the environmental impact of a plant-based diet is teeny compared to a meat-based diet. So,
Hmm.
if you eat a lot of meat, my plea would be eat less. And if you eat a little meat, my plea would be to eat a little less or cut it out altogether. Uh, but I'm also not an absolutist. Like, uh, you know, I still eat cheese. I just try. I don't eat I don't eat meat anymore, but I still eat cheese, and I try and limit the amount of milk I can. Whatever. Like everybody's
Yeah,
at a different place. But the
yeah,
bottom line is we can't produce this many animals without having a big impact on life's formula and the way that those elements move around the planet, and that is unsustainable. So we need to figure out a path forward, and for each culture and for each person, that's going to be a different piece of the path, and that's okay.
yeah, I see. So another question I have is, you mentioned that we learned how to use energy and produce nitrogen, or take a nitrogen out of the air and use it for our needs. Can something like that be invented, or maybe already exist, for pulling out CO2 from the air and recycling somehow, or storing it, using it for
That's a great
something?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let's start by the scale of the problem. So CO2 is our emissions of CO2 from burning fossil fuels and also from deforestation, but mostly from burning fossil fuels, is the cause of climate change. So we are going to both need to stop emitting CO2, and we're going to have to pull some CO2 back out of the air if we want to keep warming at a reasonable, uh,
Hmm.
livable level, right? So one of the easiest ways, in theory, to pull CO2 back out of the air is just to plant more trees or to restore ecosystems. But that's tricky because there's a reason trees have been cut down in the first place. There's social and economic reasons why those trees have been cut down. And so letting them grow back, although it sounds easy, and it is easy in that the trees will grow back, is socially and economically.
Yeah.
Um, Having said that, there are lots of places, Europe and the United States are two good examples, where trees have grown back hugely since the 1800s. So in my home state of Rhode Island in the east coast of the US, if you had been there in 1800, there would be about 20% or 30% forest and about 70% farms. And roughly speaking, it's the opposite now. It's about 70% forest and 30% non-forest. So, and that's true in Europe as well. Forests are growing back in a lot of places. So it is possible to put trees back, and that's got to be part of the solution. There are other people who say, well, why can't we just invent a machine that pulls carbon dioxide from the air and puts it somewhere? There's two challenges there. One, carbon dioxide, although it's incredibly important for warming the planet, is very dilute in the air. So imagine pouring a teaspoon of salt into a swimming pool and then pulling that salt back out, right? It takes a lot of energy to separate it back out because it's very dilute, right?
Yeah.
And the same is true of CO2. And lest a listener who doesn't believe in the science of climate change or is not convinced that the science of climate change is real, things in very small doses can have very big effects. So, for example, I'm not recommending this, but like cyanide, a very small dose of cyanide can kill you. So the idea that just because CO2 is dilute in the air, it can't have a strong effect, those two things don't go together. Small amounts of things can be very, very powerful. Yeah. Right. So just to clear that up. Okay. So we have CO2, it's dilute in the air. There are machines that can pull CO2. There are many processes, and there are many startup companies right now who are investing a huge amount of money in pulling CO2 out of the air to fight climate change and essentially to sell that carbon credit to somebody else. So you're polluting, you feel bad about it, or there's a law that says you can't pollute, and you pay someone to pull CO2 back out of the air. Because CO2 is so dilute in the air, that takes a lot of energy. So the answer to that is then, well, why don't we use renewable energy, right? The problem is that, at least for right now, if you have, let's say, 1 unit of renewable energy, it would be better to use that to replace fossil fuel on the electricity grid to heat people's houses or to drive people's cars or whatever, than it would be to use it to pull CO2 back out of the air using some machine. So right now in the world where there is a lot of fossil fuel still being used, all the renewable energy that we produce needs to go to getting rid of those fossil fuels. If we reach a point in the world where that's already done, any additional power that is clean could be used to pull CO2 from the air. The challenge, of course, is that in order to develop the technology, we need a long time. This is not an easy thing to do at a huge scale. So even though right now it doesn't make sense to use any renewable energy to pull CO2 from the air, we should just use it to replace fossil fuels. You can't get the technology deployed overnight. It's going to take decades. And so there's this debate going on right now. And I would say most of the people who study climate and engineering are on the carbon capture is a bit of a distraction. Let's focus on renewable energy and replacing fossil fuels and batteries. Worry about the carbon capture later. And I would say the business side of things and the sort of tech optimist side of things are really hard into this carbon capture. Okay. I do want to differentiate though, because I think this gets mixed up a lot in the press. There's pulling CO2 out of the air, like the air that's outside your house right now, or just generally the air. That's what we've been talking about up to this point. There's another kind of carbon capture that people talk about, which is, can we put something on the smokestack of a power plant that's burning gas or coal and catch that CO2? That's actually much easier to do because the CO2 is very concentrated because you have a fire underneath that's producing a huge amount of CO2. The problem with that is that you can't ever catch 100%. So remember what we have to do in order to avert dramatic and really deadly climate change is we have to stop 100% of our emissions. And in addition to that, we have to pull some of the CO2 we've already put in the air down. If you put a CO2 catcher on a smokestack and it catches 90% or 80% or 70%, whatever it is of the CO2, that percentage that you don't catch, that's still going into the air. So that's not getting emissions to zero. It's getting less, but not to zero. But there's no way to get it to zero. And it's not pulling anything out of the air that was already in the air. It's just reducing the extra amount you're putting in.
Yeah.
Now, 30 years ago, when solar was really in its infancy, wind hadn't really gotten going, and batteries didn't really exist, you might have made the argument that we should try this catching, at least we can catch some of it coming out of these smokestacks, right? If you had asked me that in 1993, I would have said, but we're 30 years down the road now, and clean electricity is there, and batteries are coming, and this investment in catching CO2 from power plants is really a way of just, in my opinion, is really a way of just continuing the continued use of fossil fuels for no real benefit other than the fossil fuel companies. Likewise, oil companies are very excited about catching CO2. They already actually do this on their oil fields, and they take that CO2 that they catch and they inject it into the wells to push more oil out so that there's more oil production. So again, they want carbon credits for catching the CO2, but what are they using those carbon credits for? They're using it to push more oil back out so you can burn more oil. So they're in no way compensating for all that oil they're pumping out by catching a little bit of CO2 and using it to pressurize and push oil sort of out of the sponge. So I just want to make clear for your listeners that pulling CO2 directly from the air, we're going to need to do it. Trees can do it. We may need technology to do it, but right now it takes so much energy that we'd be better to use our wind and solar to replace fossil fuels and not put the CO2 in the air in the first place, in my opinion. And then there's a separate thing, which is catching it when it comes out of smokestacks. And that is really, in my opinion, sort of like we're 30 years too late for that. And we should just be closing down these fossil fuel-based plants and replacing them with renewables plus batteries, and maybe in some cases nuclear. And, the idea might have had its day, but that day is past. And I would say most any climate change focused scientist would say we don't have time to have a partial reduction in emissions from a coal-fired power plant. We need to close those down.
Yeah, that makes sense. We need to prioritize whichever makes bigger impact right now. So I think that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So last question I have, or almost last question I have, is about just in general how to teach public about these things a little bit more, and maybe give them some tips that every day they can do something. Like I think I told you this example some time ago that I'm from Kazakhstan, and we used to have energy issues back in 90s, and we kind of got brainwashed a little bit of trying to save electricity. It's so expensive, and we don't get it all the time. But here in the US, I see, for example, people burning lights throughout, day and night outside. They don't really turn it off. They don't save it. Things like that. And also like inefficient homes when they trying to cool them, but they have windows open, or stuff like that. Simple steps. Do they really make impact? And how we can teach people to pay attention to these little things.
So I'm all for personal action, and but I don't think the answer to this is to radically change what everybody thinks about all the time. We don't have time for that. So I think what we need, and we've been very unsuccessful. Like people have been saying, "Oh, we should insulate our houses forever," and nobody does it, right? Instead they remodel their kitchen or they buy a fancy car or whatever. People don't spend money on insulation. So I think there are things that people can do, and then there are things that people are not likely to do. And so I think it has to be a mix. We need smart incentives and regulation that clean our electricity grid, so that everything up to the house, everything up to the building, all that energy that's coming to you is being produced without impact, or with much lower impact. And then we need incentives in our building codes and in the products that we buy, so that when you go to the store to buy a new fridge, you don't have to have a PhD in global change science to figure out what fridge to buy. Like the fridges that are there are energy efficient enough. Similarly, when you go to build a new home, the building code is such that you just can't burn stuff in your house. You just get a heat pump and it works, and then that's that. People don't care where their heat comes from. People don't care where their electricity comes from. They want electricity and they want heat. So there needs to be a system to supply those things, right, in a way that minimizes the impact. And then there can be price signals that induce conservation. So, for example, I'll go to Texas because it has a very unregulated market. There are places in Texas where electricity is free after 9 p.m. because there's so much wind on the grid. They can't use it all, so electricity is free. Some people do their laundry and dry their clothes after 9 p.m. because it's free. Other people don't care. They just, and I don't think humans are unique in this. All animals are wasteful with things that are not scarce. So in Kazakhstan, where electricity was scarce, you learn to conserve. In the U.S., electricity is not scarce, and for many people, it's not a big part of their expense. For a lot of people, it is, but for many people, it isn't. And for those people who don't care if their electricity bill is $100 or $200 a month, right, then you're never going to get them to care so much, to be so virtuous, in quotes, that they go around turning off all their lights. There's just not really very much incentive to do that, right? So instead, look, you mentioned light bulbs is a great example. So you can go around and turn all the light bulbs on and off you want, but the biggest thing you can do to save energy on lighting is switch from an incandescent bulb to an LED, which saves about 90% of the electricity, right? So that's not something, you're not going to invent an LED bulb, right? You just want light in your house. But if you go to the store and the LED bulb costs the same or less than an incandescent bulb, you'll buy the LED bulb. It'll last 10 times as long. It'll cost you 10 times less to run. And by the way, you have solved the problem, right? And you haven't had to convince anybody to turn the light off every time they leave the room. Yeah. So I do believe that on the margin, human behavior matters. And for some things, it really does matter. And we can talk about that. But for other things, it's really like you want a car that drives you from point A to point B. And if that car is electric and has way lower emissions and can be run off renewable electricity, great, as long as it gets you from point A to point B in the way that you like, right?
Right.
And by the way, as I said before, it's more fun to drive. I think that's more effective than saying to people, you're bad if you have a car. You should drive less. A lot of people, they live too far away to not drive sometimes. And in fact, in the case of cities where people can walk much more easily, the poorer you are, the further out on the edge of the city you tend to live with worse services. So you're more car dependent, actually, right? So yes, we need big changes to our infrastructure, and we need more walkable places to reduce cars. And yes, it would be great if people turned off their lights and didn't run their air conditioner with the windows open. But I'm kind of a nihilist about human behavior. Like, if stuff is abundant, people are going to use it and not worry about it. And so let's try to use smart design and smart technology and acknowledge human behavior and build around that, right? So, it's kind of a imperfect analogy, but human beings right now fly airplanes. And so rather than insist that your pilot is perfect, you build a system so that if your pilot makes a mistake, there's someone to catch that mistake. And if someone catches that mistake, if that person fails, there's another layer. And if that fails, there's another layer. Why do I mention that? It's because the system is designed with real people in mind. And I think if we're going to have a sustainable society, we have to design it with real people in mind, not just, environmentalist, virtuous, energy-saving people who only think about this. People live busy, complicated, hectic, stressful lives. It's not going to be their number. Most people are not going to care about this as their number one issue. And yet, we still need to fix this really, really pressing, really, really enormous challenge that in my mind is the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. So how do we do that? We have to understand that people are people. People are going to go about their daily lives, and we have to engineer the system so that when they do that, when we all do that together, the impact is less. And so, that doesn't mean I don't turn off my own lights. I do. And, I try not to eat meat, and I take my bags to the supermarket, and I drive an electric car. But part of that has to also be systemic, societal change underneath, because people just want light and heat and transportation. They don't care that they have a gas furnace or a heat pump or gas. Anyway,
right.
That's my thought.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I just wanted to clarify for myself as well, because I'm kind of thinking about those things all the time, even though like I don't have an electrical car yet. I'm thinking about it, but I don't need a new car right now. So maybe when I
Yep.
need it, when time comes, I can switch.
Okay, so let me just jump in for one last thing. Okay, so if
Yeah.
you're interested in individual things that you can do as the average American, let's say, uh, your next car should be an electric car, not a plug-in hybrid, but if you have fully electric, next best choice plug-in hybrid, nothing else besides those two. But really strong preference for fully electric, battery electric vehicle. It will be the most fun thing you've ever driven, and it's way better for the environment, and you'll be fine. Okay, so that's number one. The second thing, if you want to be virtuous, is to fly less. That's another big place that Americans have a big impact because Americans fly a lot. But the next time you do any remodeling to your house, try to put in enough insulation to switch to heat pumps. And if your house is already well enough insulated, switch out your furnace for heat pumps. Okay, so battery electric vehicle, heat pumps for your house, fly less. The last thing I'll say is eat less red meat, okay, and dairy. And after that, give yourself a break and live your life and have a good time, okay? Like, those are the big ones. And so we run this radio show that's all about trying to help people make these kinds of daily decisions. If people are interested, you can go to askpossibly.org, just a little plug for our podcast. But people are stressed out. And as a result, everything they do, they feel guilty about. And it's hard to decide what are the important things and what are not. And so, for example, you may say, oh, I don't know. I'm not sure whether I'm going to get an electric car or not, but I buy organic milk or whatever, right? Well, you know what? The electric car is way, 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 way more important than organic milk. So, like, don't allow yourself to be so overwhelmed that you don't do anything. Again, the things you could do if you're American, you own a car, electric car, heat pumps for your house, induction stove, not a gas stove, eat less red meat, fly less. Those are the big ones. Everything else, just live, and give yourself a break. But don't use the little things to make up for the fact that you didn't do the big things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's important part. Start with big things, biggest impact things, if you can.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that was well said for the last advice from you. I was saving it to the last, and we ran a little bit over time, but I think this is great information, and I hope many people will like it and learn about this stuff, and maybe go buy your book, read more about it, and start implementing these things.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it with you. These were great questions, and if people are interested in the book, it's called Elemental. Thank you so much for having me on, and it was a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, and we'll talk sometime soon.
I hope so. Okay, bye.
Bye.